Welcome to the ReThink podcast with the King Center. I'm Cameron Friend.
I'm Ferris Watkins.
And we are here to help us all learn how to rethink the critical issues that we are facing today using nonviolence. And so we are so excited for today's episode. I cannot wait.
I can't contain my excitement.
One of my favorite people in the world. Absolutely one of my favorite people in the world. We got Jane Elliott on the call with us today.
Yeah. Yes, Jane Elliott is one of the most amazing people. If I could say for our time, she's here with us, and I know that we have a lot of burning questions that we're getting ready to ask her. And so let's take it away.
Look. So just to give y'all introduction, if you don't already know who Jane Elliott is, let me go ahead and tell you. This is the description. You can find this right on her website to show you where exactly we're going today. Right on the website. And she's already trying to hide. All right. So Jane Elliott is internationally known teacher, lecturer, diversity trainer, and recipient of the National Mental Health Association Award for Excellence in Education, Exposes Prejudice and Bigotry for what it is. An irrational class system based upon purely arbitrary factors. And if you think that this does not apply to you, you are in for a rude awakening. Now, I'm not sure about you, Ferris, but that sounds like they're setting the table for us already.
It is. I mean, if you haven't experienced Dr. Jane Elliott before, you're getting ready to now. She is a powerhouse, a powerhouse that has moved the spirits of many, many people, changed their thought process, changed their entire lives. We are so grateful and so honored that she has blessed us with her presence.
And the best kind of confrontation as well. Let me just go ahead and say the best kind, nothing but truth, spitting facts. So anyway, Jane, thank you so much for being with us today. How are you today?
Well, I'd be just fine if you'd never read that introduction again, as long as I live. Number one, I'm not a teacher and I'm not a trainer. I'm an educator. And the word educator comes from the root duck deuce, which means lead, the prefix e, which means out, the suffix ate, the prefix e, which means out, the suffix ate, which means the act of, and the suffix or, which means one who does. An educator is one who is engaged in the act of leading people out of ignorance. And that's what I do. And the number one problem in this country is not racism, it is ignorance. Because if we would educate people, we would realize that there's only one race of people on the face of the earth, and that's the human race. Right. You and I are 30th to 50th cousins because we all have the same ancestor back there from 300,000 to 500,000 years ago. It's time to stop this lie. There's a book called The Myth of Race. A myth is something that, if you haven't read it, you should, but a myth is something that we make up to explain something in nature that we don't understand. A lie is something that we make up to make it all more right for us to do absolutely unforgivable things. And for us to label people according to the myth of different races is absolutely unacceptable behavior, and it has to be stopped. You and I have the same ancestors. You and I are members of the same race. We've got to get over this idea of different races. Now, I'm going to say that at least 14 times because you have to keep saying it and saying it and saying it in order to nail it down. Okay, do you have a question?
Well, look, that's the crazy thing, Farron. I didn't even ask the question yet.
Right.
We didn't even got the number one. But look, we can just walk off the set right now with all that we just got. So look, so can you just let us know, Jane, what is your background? Can you tell us about your childhood? Like, what was it like growing up for you? I mean, was this something that was pressed into you very early? Were you just seeing things that were happening? Like, how did you even get to the point where you are now?
Well, I lived in Waterloo. I was born and raised in Riceville, Iowa, which is a town of 1,000 white people and one Jewish couple. But that Jewish couple was all right because the man owned the grocery store and he would sell you groceries on credit if you paid him off at the end of the month. Okay. So he was accepted even though he was Jewish, but nobody else would have been accepted except for that. There were no people of color as far as they were concerned in Riceville, Iowa. My father was a Baptist, a believing Baptist who didn't go to church. My mother was a casual Catholic who did go to church until she married my father. And both of them were kicked out of their families because one had married into the church and the other had married outside the church. So all our in-laws called us, the seven of us, the dirty little bastards, because that's what we were. Our parents, I'm sorry, but that's. And my father, after we got old enough, the girls got old enough to reproduce, he would say, "Don't be bringing any pickaninnies into my house as grandchildren." And then My daughter married a Saudi Arabian. And we took my granddaughter and put it in my father's arms. And he said, it's the most beautiful child I've ever seen. And then he looked up at that Saudi Arabian male and that Anglican American female standing there together. And he said, that's a good cross. Because he's a farmer and he knows what constitutes a good cross. And he looked at those two people and said, that's a good cross. After that, he would not allow anyone to tell a black joke in his presence, because he'd say, you sure you want to tell that? But when we're kids, don't bring any of them into this house. I was raised to not judge. He would say, you can't judge a book by its cover or a man by his skin. But at the same time, he said, don't be bringing any of them into this house until we did it. And then everything changed for him right then.
Wow.
Well, that's incredible. Ferris, you want to follow up with our? Yeah.
Well, one, it's amazing to know that you were kind of rooted and rendered in this way of thinking. But what was that catalyst moment for you that made you say, hey, this is what my life's work is going to be about?
Well, we were living in Waterloo, Iowa. My husband ran a grocery store for the National Tea Company. And the store that he was running was in the North End, which was the black section. National Tea would not allow him to have more than one black employee, even though all of his customers were black. Well, Jim Jackson, his one black employee, quit and went to college. And Anna Mae Weems and the NAACP came in, and Anna Mae Weems said, we're going to pick at your store, Daryl. Now, she and Daryl had a good working relationship up until that very minute. He said, why would you pick at my store? She said, you don't have any black employees. He said, get me one. I want black employees. She said, no, we want to pick at your store. So she picketed the store, and that was during the 50s. Yeah, she picketed the store, and National Tea got even. They closed the store and moved it across town, across the river, where people of color couldn't get to it without owning a car. They fired Daryl after it didn't make any money, of course, because no black people went across the river to get to that National Tea store. And Daryl told them, don't put it where you're putting it, leave it where it is. They said, no, we're moving it out of the black section. That was the only grocery store in the black section in Waterloo, Iowa. It was blatant racism. And at that point, I thought, no, this I'm not going to go along with. Before that, he had been transferred to Fort Dodge, and we were buying a house. So we put the house up for rent, put an ad in the paper, and when a woman called and said, you rent to coloreds? And I'm so ashamed, but I remember thinking then, and I can remember it, thinking, if we rent this house to people of color, when we come back here, our neighbors will absolutely despise us. So I said to that woman, this is an all-white neighborhood. And I knew immediately what I had done. She said, okay, thanks, and hung up. I knew immediately what I had done. I had defected to the enemy, and I had sworn that I would never do that. I'll never do it again. I won't do it for love. I won't do it for friendship. I won't do it for money. I won't do it to be accepted by people in my community. This is the way it is. I know that what I did that day was wrong, and I will not allow this society to force me to deny my principles or my morals ever again in the area of skin color. Won't do it. And that has cost me a lot of things that I found out that I can do without, including my family.
Wow. That's one of the things I think too, Jane, that we most appreciate about you. Obviously, as somebody who's learned from you for a long time, I can tell the millennials, Gen Z generation, one of the things that people appreciate about you most is your honesty. It's not saying that you always got it right, that you always did things the right way, but it's just responding. You saw what happened around you, even decisions that you made, and you chose to be different. You chose to be different afterwards. And so your life has really resonated with that. So we really appreciate you even sharing that. And now let's get to one of my favorite things, the brown eyes and blue eyes experiment. So, I mean, you've been doing this.
Wait. Don't ever. And this is not your fault that you call it an experiment. That's the way it's written up.
Yeah.
Because if they write it up as an experiment, it discredits the whole thing.
Right.
You can't, it's illegal and unethical to experiment with people without their knowledge or without their permission. I wasn't experimenting with those children the day I did that exercise. The day Martin Luther King Jr. was killed, I was teaching third grade in all white, all Christian Riceville, Iowa. Our lesson plan for the next day was to learn the Sioux Indian prayer that says, "Oh, Great Spirit, keep me from ever judging a man until I've walked a mile in his moccasins." We were studying the Indian unit. I was taking the teepee home that my students had made the previous year. I was going to wash it, dry it, iron it, And the next day we were going to put it up and paint it with Indian symbols chosen by white folks. We were going to do what you do with the Indian unit. I walked in the back door of the house, and the telephone was ringing. I answered the telephone. It was my sister. She said, is your television on? I said, no. She said, you better turn it on. Why? Because they shot him. I said, who'd we shoot this time? Because we were in a shooting mood at that time. We were shooting a lot of people. I said, who'd we shoot this time? And she said, Martin Luther King Jr. And my world stopped spinning for a minute. And every time I think of that, and I wish I didn't have to talk about it, because every time I think of that, the world stopped, because here was a man who was only about teaching hope. And hope for me is an acronym for holding on to positive energy. That's all Martin Luther King Jr. was doing. And they killed him for it. And I was furious. So I washed the teepee, dried the teepee, got the kids' bed, got them into bed, laid it out on the living room floor, and I was ironing that with the television on, and there was Walter Cronkite saying to 3 leaders of the Black community, when our leader was killed, his widow held us together. Who's going to keep your people in line? And I thought, oh my God, did he say that?
Right.
When our leader was JFK, the leader only of white people? Oh, good Lord, his widow kept us in line. See how civilized we are? I was absolutely furious. So I changed the channel, and there was Dan Rather saying to two black males, don't you Negroes think you should feel sympathy for us white people? Because we can't feel the anger at this killing that you Negroes can. And I thought, no, by God, this is enough. I'm not going to take any more of this. So I wadded up the teepee. I threw it into the closet. I went and got my husband's supper. He was working in Charles City at that time in a factory plant. He came in. He put his arms around me. He said, they shot him, didn't they? I said, yes, they did. He said, what are you going to do? And I was sobbing. And I said, tomorrow, we're going to learn the Sioux Indian prayer. Oh, Great Spirit, keep him from ever judging a man until I've walked a mile in his moccasins. And I'm going to allow part of my students to walk in the shoes of a child of color in my classroom for a day. He said, what are you going to do? I said, I'm going to treat my children positively or negatively on the basis of the color of their eyes. He said, you lose your job. I said, if I lose my job for doing that, I'd want to teach in Riceville. He said, we need that money. We've got kids to raise. You better not do this. I said, Harold, I'm going to do it. He said, well, you're going to be sorry. Because you see, he drove back and forth to work every day with men who lived in that community. And he knew the way they talked about Martin Luther King Jr. And he knew he must have known what they said about him as they discussed the fact that he had been shot. He knew what was going to happen if I did that exercise. I didn't know. And I was determined to do that exercise because I am an educator. It is my job to lead students out of ignorance. And the number one ignorance in this country is the ignorance of thinking that we're all members of different races. So before I went to bed, I said, the only prayer I ever say anymore, oh Lord, make me an instrument of thy peace. I said it over and over like a mantra. And within 15 minutes after starting that exercise the next morning, I wondered if I'd ever say that prayer again, because things got ugly, and they got ugly fast during that day. It was absolutely, I couldn't have imagined what would happen, because I was born and raised, and my great-great-grandparents were from Riceville, Iowa. They were one of the first settlers in that area. And yet, everything just went to hell after I did the exercise and people found out about it. I went into my classroom the next morning. I separated we talked about racism. We talked about the killing of Martin Luther King Jr. He had been one of our heroes of the month in February, killed in April, had to find out why he was in the street protesting. I said, would you like to find out why he was protesting? Yeah. Would you like to find out how it feels to be a child of color in the United States of America for one day? Yeah, that sounded like fun to them. So I said, okay, we're going to separate fellow children, you people, by a physical characteristic on the basis of which you have no control, which is eye color. We can't do skin color because you're all the same color. We're going to use eye color. And I used eye color because that's one of the ways Hitler decided who went into the gas chamber.
Right.
And make no mistake about this. What has been happening in this country for the last 4 years is exactly what Hitler did in Germany and in Europe starting in 1933. And I remember because I was born in 1933, and I watched that happen from 1933 until 1945. And I've watched the same thing happen in the last 4 years that I watched happen in 1933 to 1945. I am in hopes that young people today watching what happened January 6th this year will remember that 30 years from now. And when somebody comes in and is going to pull the same trick that our former president did, these young people will say, wait a minute, we've been here before. We know what this looks like, and we're not going to let this happen. Yeah. That's the only good thing. That's the only good thing about January 6th. I didn't know how powerful racism is. I didn't know. When I separated my students according to the color of the eyes, I made the blue-eyed people move their desks to the back of the room. And I used put blue eyes on the bottom because I'm blue-eyed and I didn't want the power structure to be with the eye color, right, with the eye color. So I was on the bottom. So I got them all settled and I said, now, blue-eyed people are smarter than brown-eyed people. Brown-eyed people are smarter than blue-eyed people. They're cleaner than blue-eyed people. They're more civilized than blue-eyed people. And immediately, little brown-eyed Debbie sitting in the front row looked up at me and said, how come you're the teacher here if you got them blue eyes? And I thought, well, you little shit. And I never thought that way about it. But in that moment, that kid looked small and ugly and mean to me. And I looked weak and inferior to her because I had the wrong color eyes. I didn't realize how it felt to be on the receiving end of racism. And then Alan Moss, blue-eyed Alan Moss, in the back row stood up and said, Debbie, her eyes ain't got nothing to do with it. If she didn't have them blue eyes, she'd be the principal or the superintendent. They're both brown-eyed. And I said, thank you. I shouldn't have said thank you. I should have said, wait a minute. Don't defend me. Right. Take a look at what's happening here. But I didn't. It was just astonishing. I watched 4 dyslexic brown-eyed boys that day read words I knew they couldn't read and spell words I knew they couldn't spell and had not been able to do it the day before. At the end of the day, Billy Thompson, brown-eyed Billy, came up to my desk and said, Miss Elliott, where's my spelling paper? I said, what do you want it for, Billy? He said, I want to take it home and show it to my mother. She thinks I can't spell, and I can. And he was crying, and so was I, because he had been living down to teachers' expectations of him from kindergarten to almost the end of 3rd grade. And at the end of 3rd grade, I finally found out that he had been living down to my expectations of him. And I based my expectations of him on the kinds of things that his previous teachers said about him in the faculty lounge in the Riceville Community Elementary School. Now, if that happens with a little brown-eyed boy for one day, what happens to children of color if they never have somebody who says to them, you've been lied to? You need to know that you are the first people who look like you were first. They're the people who populated every landmass on the face of the earth. They came from Africa without any modern technology and populated every landmass on the face of the earth. Right. Nobody has said to these kids, every human being on the face of the earth has in their DNA some DNA from a country in Africa. Right. We don't tell that because that's history that we don't want to admit. And on the other hand, I had in my classroom that year, Carol, the Lutheran minister's daughter, tall, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, pale-faced, brilliant, came into my classroom reading at the 6th grade level. In February, she had never multiplied. I taught her how to multiply in the first 15 minutes of math class. She never made a mistake in multiplication again until the day she had the wrong color eyes. And on that day, that brilliant child walked with her shoulders hunched as if to ward off an expected blow. She stumbled when she crossed the classroom. She made mistakes in reading. She made mistakes in spelling, and she forgot how to multiply. Now, the only thing that had changed for her was I was forcing her to live down to my expectations of her, and she did it. It was terrifying. And it was those kids learned a lot, but I learned a whole lot more because I had a whole lot to unlearn. I had to unlearn all the stuff I had learned in psychology classes. And the stuff they're teaching in psychology and sociology classes today make me furious. When you use words like unconscious bias and conscious bias and microaggression and macroaggression, and you use those words to give excuses to pale-faced people who don't want to admit that they're all members of the same race and that their skin color is a result of their bodies that over the centuries losing some of their color as they move farther and farther from the equator and are exposed to less and less sunlight. It's time for us to stop making excuses for our ignorance and educate people as to what it's really all about. And you can't do that if you give them excuses like micro and macro, whatever. I'm really tired of this whole thing. Anyway, getting right along.
That is, I mean, there's so much that I can unpack there, but what was so interesting to me was to hear you say how the test scores really changed after this experience, and they were higher after they realized what their worth was, what their truth was. So how can we look at today's world and our culture and see, since 2012, with Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman, when we look at that and we look at the impact of our society and even the impact of our judicial system and how they viewed that entire case, had to do a lot with what was previously done, what the precedent was at that time. What are your thoughts on that?
Have you read the book, The Color of Law? If you have read it. If you haven't read the book, The Color of Law, get the book, The Color of Law, and just read pages 217 and 218, and you'll read. And you don't want to read the whole thing, but you need to read those, because if you realize that lawyers and the people who write the laws and who pass the laws and who enact the laws have been educated in the same way that you and I are, to the myth of white superiority. It is a lie. You need to realize that only from 15 to 18% of the population of the earth is identified as white. Did you know that? Wow. 15 to 18% of the population of the earth. See, you don't know that, because we have been taught that white males have done all the inventing, all the creating, all the discovering. That was all done by white males. Number one, they weren't white. We've got to stop using the words white and black. I am not white. You can see the color of my shirt. You can see the color of my hair. What color do you think my hair is? Well,
I mean, it looks white. It looks white.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. It is white. And what color do you think my shirt is? And what color do you think my shirt is?
White.
White.
And what color do you think my skin is?
Not white.
Not white. Thank you very much. It's a shade of brown. And I can see where your skin stops and your hair begins. And your skin is a shade of brown. We are all shades of brown. If you don't believe that, get the National Geographic magazine for April of 2018. You see those two girls on the front of that magazine?
Right.
Those are twin sisters. Wow. One is what we call black and one is what we call white. Would you call these girls biracial?
Wow.
Would you call them biracial?
I mean, by the terms, yes, we would call them biracial,
By standard.
Yes, of course you would, because but they aren't biracial. Neither of their parents came from outer space. These two girls are members of the same race, the human race. Instead of calling these girls biracial, let's call them mosaic. Right. A mosaic is an art form that is new and beautiful and made of many different elements. Right. Mosaic is a much better word to describe these two girls than biracial. Inside this magazine, there is a set of pictures of human beings, different colors, all different colors. And under each one of them, there's the word Pantone and a number. Every human being on the face of the earth can find their skin color on the Pantone color line, color wheel. Get a copy of the Pantone color wheel, put it on the wall, have children go up and put their hands against it so that the palm of their hand is against the paper, and they can find the color of their skin on the back of their hand by putting it up against that color wheel. And then those kids will see that every one of them has a color on the color wheel. See if they can find a word that describes that color in the thesaurus. Go to the thesaurus, and look up synonyms for brown. There are at least 100 synonyms for brown in the thesaurus. Have the kids pick out one of those that seems to match the color on the color wheel, and then go to the dictionary and find out the definition of the description of that color in the dictionary. And that's the color those kids should be calling themselves in the future, instead of black and white. Yeah. Black and white are polar opposites. In the dictionary, white is the color of purity and goodness. Black is the color of savagery and evil. Now you're going to keep calling little black boys black. You're going to tell them from the day they're born that they're savage and evil, because that's what we're going to call them. And you're going to call little white boys pure and good. It's time to give it up, people. Words are the most powerful weapon devised by humankind. Yeah. We use words to kill people all day, every day. We need to change our definition of people, our description of people. If you don't have enough iron in your body to keep you healthy, you're called anemic. If you don't have enough melanin in your skin to protect your cells from the rays of the sun, you must be melanemic. And if you have more, you must be melanaceous. And if you have a lot, you must be melanotic. Now, the word melanotic is in the dictionary, and it means having a lot of melanin in your skin, to almost be black, but not black, almost be black. You need to remember that. I think we should stop using white and use melanemic. And for people who are darker skinned, melanaceous. And for those who are very dark, melanotic. There are no negative connotations or positive connotations to those three words. Now, we've got melanotic in the dictionary. Before I die, we're going to get melanemic and melanaceous in there. Those three words all belong in the dictionary.
Well, Jane, I love that. I will gladly walk around calling myself melanaceous. I ain't got no issue with that at all. Here, so we only have a couple minutes left, and this is, I mean, we gonna have to do this over again because there's so much more we got to get to.
I got a lot of questions.
but for you, and I know this is short, but how do you feel that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and or Mrs. Coretta Scott King, how do you feel like they have impacted either the work that you are doing, but maybe even just the framework that you're coming from?
They're the reason I'm doing this work, because here was a man who knew a way to bring us all to our senses. If he and Malcolm X had gotten together, they would have drastically and positively changed the United States of America. So they both had to die. Don't for an instant think that they died just because some lone nitwit wanted to kill them. Those people were hired to do away with a threat. And the threat was that those two powerful men who are melanaceous and melanotic could have totally changed the picture in this country. If you haven't read this book, and I think I just told you, Rich, thanks to racism, get this book, and then you'll realize why I'm angry and why I know why you're angry, but I'm angry for another reason. I have been lied to and have been allowed to take advantage of that lie for the last 87 years. This makes no sense. Every Black woman in the United States of America knows more than I do about racism. They've forgotten more since breakfast than I will ever learn about racism. And so they call me to talk about racism because you don't want to listen to Black women who know the truth.
Wow.
And who survived in spite of what we did, in spite of what we've done to them. That's why I refuse to have anybody say to me, "Oh, you are so courageous." That's barn dirt. It doesn't take courage for me to do what I do. It takes courage to be a Black woman. I'll never forget, oh my God, the Black woman whom I asked to stand beside me while we talk about differences in a college in upstate New York. And there was a tall white male standing on my left and a taller Black woman standing on my right. And I asked the audience, you see any differences here? Yes, what's the first difference you see? They said height. I thought, you are all teachers, educators, and the college level. And that's the first, I thought you just flunked the first test, fool. So I said to this white male, is your height important to you? He said, never have to think about it. I said, well, would you rather be your height or mine? And I'm 5'1" on a good day. Well, my height, of course. I said, all right, so your height is important to you. Do you lie a lot? He said, I didn't lie. I said, well, you either lied or you misspoke. So I said to the all Black woman, is your height important to you? She said, yes, but there are other differences. I said, we're going to get to them. And she was as dark skinned as you can be. So I said, do you see any other differences? So then they said gender. So we had to cover that one. So then we went through the whole same thing all over again. And the Black woman said, there are some other differences to deal with. So I said, do you see any other differences? So then they said age. So we went through that. Now, these are educated people. So I finally said, now, do you see any other differences here? And somebody finally said, color. I said, are you talking about skin or hair? She said, skin color. So I said to this white male, is your skin color important to you? He said, I never have to think about it. I said, really? You never have to think about it? No. Does your color give you power? Yes. I said, and you appreciate, and you know it. He said, yes, I do. I've got a lot of power. I'm not afraid of anything. I thought, oh, you fool. You should be afraid of me right now, even though I'm shorter than you are. So then I turned to this Black woman. I said, is your skin color important to you? And she paused a long time. And she finally said, I'm going to say something I've never said out loud before. I said, and that would be, she said, and that's because, she said, I'm ashamed of it. I said, and that would be what were you going to tell us? She said, I have 2 children. Both of them are girls. Both times that I was pregnant, I prayed that I wouldn't have a son. I said, and that's because, she said, because I didn't want to think about what he'd have to go through and about what I'd have to go through when I lost him. Well, you could have heard a feather fall in that room. Nobody said a word. That was the best education I have ever received. And that woman taught them more with 3 sentences that I could have taught them in a lifetime.
Yeah.
Think about that.
Yeah.
Talk about courage. That woman had courage. She was crying. I was crying. Everybody in the room was crying. Even this white fool man standing beside me was going, and I thought, cry, you miserable SOB. I am not a kind person.
Yeah. Well, Jane, we want to thank you so much for this time. We are going to have to have you back on because there's so much other stuff that we have to get to. But, you know, I know that myself, I don't want to speak for Ferris, but I know that we are very thankful for this conversation that we got an opportunity to have. I mean, ReThink is better because of this conversation. So again, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for taking the time.
Yeah, you have taught us so much. There's tangible advice that you have given us that are really going to be monumental moments in each and every one of our lives to help us be the next leaders of our day. So thank you.
But wait, get the book, Nile Valley Contributions to Civilization by Anthony Browder. Read that book this week and tell everybody that you talk to read that book and realize how brilliant those people from Egypt, which is a country in Africa, were 4,000 years before Jesus Christ was born. Read that book and realize the talent, the skill, the intelligence that we have managed not to recognize and not to take advantage of because of our ignorance about skin color.
Yeah.
Well, y'all, that's going to do it for the ReThink podcast, you all. We will see y'all soon.
Thank you.